And now let me turn to a country which for a long time was associated with beautiful mountains and yodeling. No. It's called Switzerland, and certainly the image of Switzerland has always been a very good one. It's a small country and therefore not an aggressive country. It's a clean country. It's one of those countries where you can have glass buildings because they wash the windows. In Paris, that's not the case. The Pompidou Center is made out of glass, but they don't wash the windows. All right, so but in Switzerland, no matter where you go, they what? They wash the windows, wash the floors. It's clean. It's certainly beautiful, right? I mean, all those mountains, there they are, and everybody goes there, and they arrive at Interlaken or who knows where, St. Moritz, Gstaad, doesn't make any difference. You just look up and what? Gorgeous, gorgeous, gorgeous. Certainly a pleasant contrast to Michigan. It's prosperous. Wherever you go, people are what? Prosperous, and they appear to be hard-working, prosperous, hard-working. And certainly the image that they presented during World War II was heroic, or going all the way back to William Tell. A small people defying the great nations of Europe. In World War II, Switzerland was surrounded by Adolf Hitler, and yet it was not occupied. And the story that I remember reading in the newspaper and hearing in the classroom was that the commander-in-chief of the Swiss army said that if the Germans dare to invade Switzerland, we shall pull back to the mountains, we shall fight to the last man. Certainly the image of Switzerland, it doesn't have any kings or queens. It was famous as being like the home of democracy. 23 little cantons. If you want to, you can't call them states. They're like independent counties. Some of them are smaller than counties in Michigan. And in some of them, they're so small that all the people of the county get together in a big field and vote on issues. What could be more democratic, huh? It's like the ultimate democracy. That was the image of Switzerland. And what everybody says, well, look at Canada. You get 2 languages, it doesn't work. Look at Belgium. You get 2 languages, it what? Doesn't work. Look at Switzerland. They got 4 languages, and they love each other. There's the Germans and the French and the Italians, and there's a little language which is found in Graubünden, which is Romansh. Romansh is a kind of Romance language different from Italian, coming from Latin also, that's spoken by a small number of people. And here they are, all those 4 languages, and they're all living together happily ever after. They're like a role model for the world. So the image of the Swiss has always been very good. And most of us grew up on Swiss cheese. There it was. It's this image. And of all the countries in the world, it certainly was reinforced by the fact that wonderful things had their headquarters there. When the League of Nations wanted a headquarters, where did they go? They went to Geneva. Isn't that internationalism? When the International Red Cross wanted a headquarters, where did they go? They went to Switzerland. It was a place you went to because it was peace-loving and it was wonderful and everybody could feel comfortable and welcome. Got the image? Well, they had spent a lot of time cultivating this image. Do you think images are easy to create? But now this image is somewhat shattered. Over the last year, Switzerland has entered into the news with a different kind of image. Its image is tarnished. Mud has been thrown against it. On the one side is an organization known as the World Jewish Congress, headed by the man whose family was clever enough to invent Seagrams. All right. His name is Edgar Bronfman. He certainly is very rich, and he has been, since 1981, the leader of the World Jewish Congress, allied against the Swiss is the American government. In fact, a commission was established by the American government to investigate the behavior of the Swiss during the war. And out of that investigation came terrible accusations against the behavior of the Swiss. On the accusing side is a famous senator from New York whose reputation went up and then it went down. And now it came back up again. His name is Senator D'Amato. And last October, October 16th, 1996, he hurled accusations of crime against the Swiss government. No, Mr. Clean over there, he said. On the other side, opposing them, is one of the most successful collections of bankers in the world. I mean, I don't know any Swiss bankers, and maybe there are people in this room who do know Swiss bankers, and if you are a relative of a Swiss banker, I'd like to talk to you. No. After the talk. But I mean, there is this association of famous banks, several dozen banks, 3 or 4 extremely powerful. And certainly since 1900, well, going back to 1856 when Credit Suisse was established, but certainly in 1922 after the laws of secrecy were agreed on by the Swiss banks, these banks have what? Boomed. But Swiss banks were regarded as honorable, reliable, dependable. The image of the discreet banker, well, so they're on the other side getting the mud thrown in their face, and allied with them are certain officials of the Swiss government. And attached to them, unavoidably, are the people of Switzerland. The public can't distinguish between Swiss bankers, Swiss government, Swiss people. What are the accusations? Well, the accusations are pretty horrible. The accusations are, one, that families involved as victims of the Holocaust in desperation deposited their money in Swiss banks, and that this money after the war was never returned to their families, that no effort was made even to find these people, to find out whether they were alive or dead, or if dead, that they would at least give the money to the families, and if there were no families, at least to people who were related to other victims of the Holocaust. Accusation that prominent Nazis all over Europe deposited their monies in Swiss banks during the war, that the Swiss banks knowingly accepted this money, and after the war resisted returning it, in a sense, to the places from which it was looted. One of the things that was deposited in Swiss banks was the entire gold reserve of Belgium and Holland, looted by the German Nazis and placed in Swiss banks. Now, it's hard to bring in a country's entire gold reserve without somebody noticing it. I think nobody's ever given me a gold reserve, so I don't know. But it would seem to me it would be difficult to do that. Accusation that during the war, the Swiss government made loans to the Nazi government, even after 1943, even after it was very clear that the Germans were losing the war, loans were made. And above all, that after the war, when the Swiss could have owned up at least to some of the things they did, they practiced gross deception which allowed them to keep, at that time, hundreds of millions of dollars, which today are worth, multiplied by 10, do you understand? Billions of dollars in their banks. Now they may wash their windows, but these accusations stain the reputation of Switzerland, and the response of the Swiss is enormous discomfort. They have never been accustomed to be in this situation. They have always been the nice, little, heroic people. And they've always had William Tell. I thought his overture had been written for the Lone Ranger, and then I discovered it was for, for another reason. So so there they are. And in fact, if you check with the Swiss press and with people who've been to Switzerland, there's a lot of public discomfort and anger against these assaults, because in the Swiss mind, being Swiss is to be in some way, in every way, superior. Well, what I want to explore indeed is whether these accusations are true, and indeed, if they are not true, what are the implications, and if they are true, what are the implications? In order to do that, I have to tell you a little bit about Switzerland, which isn't easy to see on the map. I mean, it's a small country. It's only 15,000 or 16,000 square miles. Now, 16,000 square miles, compare that to Michigan. So Michigan is what? You all remember that. I keep saying it all the time. 57,000 square miles. Yeah, 57,000. Hang on to it, because in case you're on a quiz show. No. It'll be very, very helpful. It's a very small country divided up into 23 cantons. Now, you can't call the cantons states because they're so tiny. Many of them are, as I said, smaller than the counties in Michigan. But there they are. So there it is in Western Europe. To understand it, of course, it lies at the junction of three nations that are in Western Europe, the three most important nations. The English never regard themselves as being in Europe, so I'll exclude them. All right, fine. They don't like being European. All right. The French, the German, and the Italians, I mean, their borders somehow come together right where Switzerland is. The most important thing about Switzerland is that it lies at least 3/5 of it lie on top of the highest mountains in Europe. They're called the Alps. And the Alps are in Western and Central Europe in the southern part. They tend to be most rugged and the highest on their western edge. Austria is also alpine. In fact, Austria is 2/3 covered by the Alps. But Switzerland has the highest. And so when you go to Switzerland, that's why you go to Switzerland, right? Not to see the flat land, but to see the highland, to see the Alps. Certainly, Switzerland is the place, it's the watershed from which all those famous rivers come. People don't realize that Oakland County, being one of the highest spots in Michigan, is a watershed. Do you know that? All the rivers are here, like the Saginaw starts and goes down to the bay, and the Rouge starts up here and goes down to the river. I look around, it looks so flat to me, but I guess it's a watershed. But this is a real watershed, all right, and it's high up, and two great rivers flow out of the Alps there. One is the Rhone. The Rhone River heads west and then makes a sharp turn going south, and ends up near Marseille in the Mediterranean Sea. And the other one, and the sources of the two rivers are very close, if you ever look at the map, is the Rhine, which makes a big curve, comes around the northern boundary of Switzerland, and then heads all the way through Germany and Holland to the North Sea. So the two rivers start there, and in fact, in addition to those rivers are tributaries. Most of the tributaries flow into the Rhine. And what happens is sometimes they widen. And when they widen, they produce these things we call lakes. So Switzerland is dotted. It looks better than Cass Lake. There's Lake Lucerne, and so I mean we got all these lakes, these gorgeous lakes, as the rivers widen and flow down into the Rhine and sometimes into the Rhone. In addition to the Alps, there's an older set of mountains which are on the western boundary of Switzerland. You know, the earth keeps crumbling and crushing and whatever at different times. The Alps are new, but the other mountains are like the Appalachians. They've been worn down. They're older. They're called the Jura or Jura Mountains, and they lie between the land of Switzerland and France, and they define the western boundary, and they sort of bump into the Alps. And between the Alps and the Jura, is what's called the Mittelland. It's comparatively flat, and that's where most of the Swiss live. I mean, it's hard to live on top of a mountaintop. In that flat land, you find cities like Zurich, Basel, even Lucerne is right on the edge of the flatland. Most of the people live in northern Switzerland because it's easier to live on flatland than to live on highland. That's called the Mittelland. And if you put all of that together, you still get a what? A very small country. Gorgeous but small. Now, how did it come to exist? I mean, after all, there is a French language, there is an Italian language, there is a German language, but there is no Swiss language spoken by the Swiss. It's this odd combination of Germans and French and Italians all put together. How did that come to pass? Well, when we first hear about the area is inhabited by people who spoke like the Irish. They were called the Celts, and they lived there, and they were conquered by the Romans. And the Romans had a hard time building fortresses there. They didn't have to build fortresses because it was a natural boundary for the Romans to keep the barbarians out. Only crazy barbarians would what? Try to cross into the Roman Empire by crossing the Alps. In time, the Romans left or were driven out by the arrival of the people who are still the main population in Switzerland. The main population in Switzerland is German. Certainly after World War II, it was not popular to refer to them as Germans. Like Austrians, they always called themselves just Austrians or Swiss. But obviously they were part of the German Empire. That is, Germans poured down out of the north and occupied this whole area, and two German nations settled down in the area. One are called the Alemannians. They gave us the French word for Germany, Allemagne. But also they're called the Swabians, Schwaben. And in fact, most of the people in Switzerland are Swabians. That is, they're Schwaben. They belong to the same people that are to be found in Baden or Württemberg or in Alsace. It was this area, a group of German tribes put together into a German nation, and there they were. Another group of people who came into the area, Germans, were called the Burgundians. And they poured down and they occupied most of the area between what today is Switzerland and the Riviera. In those days, there was no Riviera to speak of. a lot of barbarians, and the Burgundians gave up speaking German and ultimately were integrated into the Latin-speaking world of the people who were there, which meant that they ultimately came to speak French. So there were these two German peoples, and they were in the area, and some of them went up into the mountains. And you have to understand the purpose of the mountains if you have continuous invasions. People trying to find safety do what? They go up. They go up into the mountains. It's one of the places that you can find safety, and that was continuous. And so there developed over the years a group of people who were, in a sense, the original Swiss. They were mainly German-speaking mountaineers. How they made their living, well, you hear a tinkle, tinkle, tinkle before the tourists arrived. They had cows. The land was not good for farming. I haven't done much farming in my day, but it's not a good place for farming. But if you have a cow, it will give milk, and certainly one of the major old industries of Switzerland, remember the cheese and all of that, has to do with dairy farming. And the mountaineers were hard to control because warriors couldn't pursue them and impose their rule, so they tended to be fairly autonomous. They were up in the mountains. It's true everywhere. They were up in the mountains, and it was hard to get to them. Now, as time went on, a kingdom of Germany was established. And in fact, in the kingdom of Germany, there were certain big duchies. The Duchy of Bavaria, the Duchy of Saxony. Each one corresponded to a German nation, and there was a duchy called the Duchy of Schwaben, or of Swabia. And in fact, Switzerland was basically what? Part of that duchy, and then the duchy was divided up into counties, each one of which had a what? A count or an earl, and then the counties were divided up because that's the way the feudal system operated. Now, what happened in time was that the king of Germany rewarded his warriors, the warriors that supported him, with land. Now, this land was not regarded as terribly good land, you have to understand. It was up in the mountains, and there was no tourist industry. There was a family that came out of Alsace and were rather ambitious, and they were so ambitious that they wanted to be the kings of Germany. We first hear about them in the early 11th century, somewhere around 1020. Their name, Habsburg. When they first emerged, they had nothing to do with Vienna. They were not in Austria. They ultimately got Austria, but that isn't where they came from. They came from around Switzerland. And they were awarded by the King of Germany some of this mountain area. And in the middle of the 13th century, they decided to establish control over what the king had given them. So they moved in. And that's the story of William Tell, right? They moved in, now to impose their authority, now to collect taxes, and the mountaineers, who had never been bothered before, got what? Got very angry. They didn't mind the Count of Schwyz, who lived up in Alsace. They didn't care what he called himself. What they objected to was his sending soldiers in to their area to collect taxes. They didn't pay taxes to anybody. So a rebellion arose up in the mountains in 3 little districts which were given to the Habsburgs. One was called Uri. It's right near, they're all on Lake Lucerne. Lake Lucerne, or Lucerne, is right in the middle of Switzerland. It's right as you go up to the Alps, and it's sort of forested. Right there, anybody who goes to Lucerne, you get on the boat, isn't that much money. And you go around the lake, and then they show you where it all started. What happened was this little canton of Uri, and this little canton of Schwyz, and this little canton of Unterwalden itsy bitsy little places, do you understand, decided they weren't going to pay taxes. Well, that's familiar. So they ultimately met together on a field. The tourist boat will stop there. It's called Rutle. And there they pledged themselves to defend their freedom. So they fought the Habsburg army and they defeated it. Now, attached to that is a story that appears in Swiss schools, which most likely is not true. It's like George Washington never telling a lie. That doesn't diminish him if he did tell a lie. Do you understand? He could have told one lie, right? The story is about a leader called William Tell. And there is this terrible, terrible bailiff, the agent of the Habsburgs, whose name is Gessler. And ultimately, he forces William Tell into a terrible situation for survival. The boy, the apple, the arrow. Oh, well. If I tell you it never happened, would it really destroy? I don't want, forget it, I didn't say it, whatever. All we know is that they organized themselves, and in fact, for the next 200 years, these mountaineers turned into the best soldiers in Europe. Because the Habsburgs sent army after army. The Habsburgs were a very ambitious family. I mean, you could tell from the chin. They were determined. They were determined to make it. In fact, in 1273, Rudolph of Habsburg was elected king of Germany. And he remained king until 1291. It was in 1291, on August the 1st, that this League of Three Cantons was formed. And what made it unique in Europe was that it wasn't governed by a duke or by a count. It basically was a democratically elected council. And what brought them together and kept them together was the enemy. They were not very good at merging, but they stayed together and fought together for 200 years because the Habsburgs got rich. They got Austria and Vienna. And then they took Bohemia and Prague, and they were into it. And I do want to tell you something, that despite all their power, it was like the Americans in Vietnam, their armies could not win in that territory. And one of the big questions that was now being asked in Vienna, to which the Habsburgs had moved, was, what are we doing there? Who cares if we capture 6 more cows? It's like Vietnam. What are we doing there? Why? But, you know, their pride was invested in, and there's so many battles, Morgarten, Sembach, the whole thing, and if you go to a Swiss public school, they tell you all about it. It's the heroic resistance of the Swiss against the Habsburgs, and finally, in the middle of the 15th century, the Habsburgs said, enough. They went off to take bigger things. And they were to last a long time. They were no longer interested in the Swiss. The name Swiss, well, that ultimately emerged because there were 3 cantons at the beginning. One of them, it's on Lake Lucerne, is called Schwyz. All right, so that became the basis of the name of the country of Switzerland. But it wasn't an independent country. It was a bunch of German mountaineers who didn't want to pay taxes. And they were federated. They were like the Hatfields and the McCoys up in the mountains of West Virginia, and that's where they were. I mean, they weren't regarded as a separate country. They were still theoretically under the control of the King of Germany. And then they proved their mettle as soldiers. As time went on, more and more of them gave up dairy cows and became fighters. In France, there was a very ambitious politician whose name was Charles, the Duke of Burgundy. and he came into the Swiss area. He wanted to conquer it because he wanted to be the king of France. And in 1476, nobody could believe it, his armies advancing into this little territory. In the 14th century, the Swiss, by virtue of defending themselves, had recruited other places, other little cantons, other little districts that threw out their counts and now became, like the original three, sort of autonomous, theoretically democratic cantons. You have to understand that in some of these cantons, not everybody could vote. One of them was Lucerne. One of them was Zurich. We're now down on the plain in the Mittelland. And a very big one was a city called Bern. And so now this area is expanding. There are almost 9 cantons that are together. And now Charles of Burgundy comes and they give him a whammo, 1476. And when they do, they now develop their new career. So I want to tell you what the Swiss were for a while, how they made a living. Are you ever familiar with the Gurkhas in Nepal? Gurkhas are people that look like the Tibetans. They live in Nepal, and they were not conquered by the British, but the area was taken over by the British. And the British didn't have enough British soldiers to control India. So they hired mercenaries. They hired the Gurkhas, all right? You can see, you saw them in Hong Kong. They hired the Gurkhas to patrol, to control. And the Gurkhas were glad to do that because they preferred fighting to anything else. And they became mercenaries. They were hired out. They were mountain people, and mountain people have strong lungs and they're good fighters and the whole thing, and they were hired by the British. Well, that's what now happened to the Swiss. If you go to the Vatican, you see the what? The Swiss Guard. What is the Pope doing with the Swiss Guard? Well, the answer is very clear. At the end of the 15th century and the beginning of the 16th century, the Swiss, for a century and a half, turned to a business which became very, very important. They sold themselves as soldiers to anybody who would pay the money. They now declared themselves to be neutral, which meant we'll work for anybody, right? And in fact, the King of France was so impressed by what they did to Charles, Duke of Burgundy, he said, I'll hire a few. So the King of France hired the Swiss. The Pope, who was surrounded by enemies, hired a lot of Swiss because what? He figured they were the best, they were like Gurkhas. They were the best soldiers possible. Nobody could read or write. They were not bankers. They were what? Mercenary soldiers. And for a century and a half, that was the reputation of the Swiss. Tough mountaineers you could hire. One day they fought for the French. The next day they fought for the Germans. They even fought for the House of Habsburg. For money, they what? They forgot who their old enemies were. They were now for sale. They had developed a profession. And that profession was to define them for a long, long time. But the area fell into trouble, and I want to explain. In the early part of the 16th century, there arrived the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation was embraced by many of the people living in the cities of the Mittelland, in Lucerne, well, in Zurich and in Basel and places like that. And in fact, one of the great heroes of the Protestant Reformation, a man by the name of Ulrich Zwingli, had his headquarters in Zurich, and therefore northern Switzerland became a haven of Protestantism. But most of the high mountain cantons remained Catholic. And that now created a problem that was to destroy the economy of Switzerland. Because instead of hiring out as mercenaries to fight for other people, they now began to kill each other. And so Switzerland was divided, still is divided. When I was born, in 1928, the Protestants outnumbered the Catholics. But today, the Catholics outnumber the Protestants, and it's sort of back and forth. And in fact, what happened to Switzerland was that it was drowned in the Reformation. And then the Reformation War produced 30 years of war in Germany, and Switzerland was part of Germany. And for 30 years, Protestants killed Catholics and Catholics killed Protestants. And in 1648, when the war was over and a truce was declared between the Protestants and the Catholics, little Switzerland left Germany. I mean, the cantons were exhausted from the war. And now mercenaries were less needed because now national armies were being created by the other nations, and so the economy wasn't so good. One of the problems that then arose in the 18th century was, if we couldn't sell ourselves as soldiers, how do we make a living? Well, so you get milk. Well, how could you transport? I mean, the whole thing. The economy was very, very backward, and in fact, in the 18th century, people told very nasty jokes about the Swiss. They were always the dumb people in the. They were the dumb people in the joke, because they were mountaineers and they yodeled. So I mean, the image of the Swiss is entirely different from what ultimately it became. And then the French Revolution showed up. And Napoleon invades Switzerland, and the Swiss are unable to keep him back. He reorganizes the country, centralizes everything, but then of course he's defeated. And in 1815, in Vienna, at a congress led by the Habsburgs, who are now the what? The emperors of Austria, Switzerland is declared independent. That's confirmed, 1815. And they add a few cantons to Switzerland, which they take away from France because they want to punish France, since France was defeated. And in 1815, the Swiss pick up a city which now has the most expensive lunches in the world. It's called Geneva. Oh. It now became part of Switzerland. It was added, so some more French are added to this whole thing, and a few Italians in the south are added to this German Switzerland, and things go on. But the big question is, what's the economy? And in fact, between 1815 and 1848, things get worse, because the old argument starts up between Protestants and Catholics. Every canton is independent. And in some cantons, which are Protestant, they don't want any Catholics in there. It would be as though Ohio says, we're Protestant, and Michigan's Catholic, and no Catholics can move into Ohio. What kind of a country is this? So already, by the early 1840s, the Catholics organized themselves into a league called the Sonderbund, and a civil war breaks out. And then it's very clear that this country has no future. If the Protestants and Catholics can't get along, if there are no mercenary jobs, if milk isn't selling, then we better get our act together. Up until 1848, there were now 23 Swiss counties or cantons. Each county or canton was self-governing. Each one had its own currency, and each one had its own postage. They were fiercely independent. You got that? Mountaineers. But in 1848, they all got together and they created the famous Constitution. That's the year. In 1848, they finally realized mercenary time is over. They now created a new kind of government. It was still very decentralized. In Switzerland, education, almost everything except foreign policy and the currency and general economic policy is decided by each canton, no matter how small. Each canton has a little council, all right, which is democratically elected. But now they created a national government, which included a national council, the representatives of which came out of districts divided up by population. They created an imitation of the American Senate, a Senate in which there are 46 senators, 2 senators for each canton. So if you're in a little canton that's smaller than this room, you got what? 2 senators. And if you're in Bern, which is fairly big, you got what? You got 2 senators. You got the whole picture, sort of like an American-style government. Actually, Switzerland as a government is much younger than the United States of America. It wasn't put together until 1848. And then the Senate and the House of Representatives get together, and that's called the Federal Assembly, and they elect an executive of 7 people. Now, no canton can have 2 of the 7. Do you understand? So it's sort of divided up, but there are 23 cantons, so not everybody can get somebody on the federal council. And they run the government. And then somebody from there is elected the chairman of it, and he's called the president, and his term only lasts for 1 year. Now, it is not the most centralized government in the world. It's a very decentralized government. But compared to what they had, it what? It was better. But that wasn't the question. The question was, what about religion? Well, they finally decided in 1848 that Protestants and Catholics could live anywhere they wanted to. Oh, well, that was nice. It's 1848. Jews, they weren't sure about. It took them another 25 years to get the Jews into the act. The Swiss are very slow-moving. All right, so it takes them a while. They were mountaineer tradition. It took them a long time to get used to it. But ultimately, they give the foundation of what we would call a liberal democracy. By the way, I do want to tell you something about democracy. Democracy isn't always associated with freedom. What if you get everybody into a field and they all unanimously vote that the only people who should live in the neighborhood are Protestants? Well, it's democratic in the sense that what? The majority have voted, but it's not what we would call historically liberal, because what? It doesn't allow for individual freedom. You have to make that distinction, and that's part of the story of Switzerland. There was a democratic tradition, but there wasn't a strong liberal tradition which allowed for individual freedom, and so that was one of the tensions. And they also decided there would be 3 official languages: German, which was spoken by over 65% of the people in Switzerland, and French, which was spoken by about 18% of the people in Switzerland. Switzerland is overwhelmingly German. And 12% speak Italian, and there are a variety of other things that are included in the percentages. And they now had a fundamental problem. The problem for Switzerland was not just getting their act together politically, it was, what kind of an economy? Well, let me tell you what now developed. What developed now, they got railways and some transportation, and building railways in Switzerland was not easy. It's fun if you're a tourist. If you're on the building side of it, it's not so easy, all right? Dairy farming, that was very big. Dairy farming. The other thing was forestry, wood, like Michigan, right? Wood, wood, wood. There's a lot of wood up there in the chop, 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 wood, wood, wood. And in fact, they made things out of wood, cute little things like cuckoo clocks. No, the Swiss were associated with all this, what I call yodel rye. I mean, you know, it's some people like it and other people think it's, you know, it's cuckoo, cuckoo. You got it? I mean, you know the stuff I'm talking about? A little painted over here, and a yodel, and a cuckoo, and a yodel, and a cuckoo. Okay, fine. And they made those things. In fact, from cuckoo clocks, they got to watches. But the whole thing. Another thing they developed were textiles. They had a lot of potential for water power. And so that enabled them to provide power for textile plants. The places like Zurich became centers of textiles. And because they had to dye the textiles, they needed chemicals. And that was the beginning of what we call the Swiss chemical. One thing led to another, but it was just the beginnings of things. It wasn't a great upsurge in the economy. But then, in 1856, somebody got the idea. They got the same idea in the Cayman Islands. Wouldn't it be nice to have a place which could be a haven for people who wanted to deposit their money without the government sticking its nose into what you deposit? That was no longer possible in big countries that were into extensive taxation. In France, the government was now what? Sticking its nose into your deposit. In Germany, the government was what? It needed money, was sticking its nose into your deposit. In Britain, they were sticking their nose into your deposit. In Italy, they were sticking their nose into your deposit. But Switzerland had no government. I mean, you have to understand, this federal government had no power for all practical purposes. The cantons were very jealous of their own local power. There was nobody sticking any nose into anything, and there were no taxes. That's why they rebelled to begin with. It's like central Montana. All right. So it was a perfect place to open a bank and then say to everybody, deposit your money, no questions, nothing. And that was the beginning. And that was reinforced in 1922 by not a law passed by the Swiss government, but by a decision made by the Swiss Banking Association. Unrelated to the government. The Swiss government was now talking about taxing corporations and taxing capital gains. For the first time in Switzerland, when you talk about taxes, I mean, it makes the conversation in America look tame. And when that was out, the bank said, we'll get no depositors. So they passed the law, and the Swiss government didn't abolish it. They let them keep it. It's still there. The law says that if you deposit money in our bank, nobody will ever know what's in your account. None of your relatives. Nobody. No government. Do you understand? Ooh. All of a sudden, after 1922, who cared about milk? They're poured now into these Swiss banks. Do you understand what now? All this money. Everybody wants a secret place. It was like having your own mattress. Do you understand? Only it was in Switzerland. And all kinds of money was there. All kinds of people who say, I don't have any money. Well, their money was in Switzerland, and it was like the Cayman. Do you understand? It's a refuge. So they went from mercenaries, which stopped being a good business, right? They went from mercenaries to secret banking, and they began to boom. And now there arose a new aristocracy in Switzerland. They didn't yodel. They went to London and bought their suits at Brooks Brothers. They're called Swiss bankers. And they had clubs and associations. And in many respects, they were much more powerful than the government because the government was always so weak. So they ruled the roost. And in fact, they were also good for Swiss industry because now there was all this money to invest in what? precision instruments, and which came from Cuckoo Clock, and the chemical industry and whatever else it was, which was related to the textiles. Now it began to expand, but there remained in Switzerland certain tensions. There was always the tension between the Protestants and the Catholics. The one thing for years, which was an aggravation, was the Protestants said, Catholics can do Catholicism, but there can't be any Jesuits in this country. We hate Jesuits. They're troublemakers. There was the tension between everybody, oh, they all love each other with the same language. Well, by the way, you don't find signs in 3 languages in Switzerland. If you're in a German canton, the signs are what? In German. If you're in a French canton, they are in French. And if you're in an Italian canton, they are what? They are in Italian. It's not like crossing to Windsor. Okay, so... and the tensions were great because what was very clear, and nobody would say it because everybody called himself Swiss. It's like saying I'm a Michigander. Well, what does that mean? What's your ethnic origin? What was very clear was that most Swiss were, even though they spoke a funny German dialect, they were German. One of the main tensions was between the cantons and the central government. The central government could never even act against the bankers if they wanted to because it was so weak and everything was so decentralized. One of the main tensions came in bread and chocolate. Remember that one? Oh. The movie. All right. When they were poor, nobody wanted to go to Switzerland. Now that they were rich, immigrants. So you're leaving Minsk. Oh, well. You could go to New York, whatever else it is. It wouldn't be bad to go to what? Maybe to Basel or Zurich or something like that. I mean, there is money there. The place is what? Getting richer. But what was very much a source of tension was these people were mountaineers by origin and temperament. They didn't like foreigners. So what they did was, as they got richer and didn't want to dust their own houses, they brought in Italians, remember? They were the waiters and the whole thing, but they didn't let them stay, and they did not let them become citizens of the country. From very early in this century, Swiss citizenship became almost impossible to acquire. And in fact, the foundation of all that hostility, despite this wonderful image of this country, was racist. We don't like certain people, and they will not be citizens of this country. Obviously, one of the tensions was between the bankers and the public, because a party did arise in Switzerland called the Social Democratic Party. One of its planks was bankers should pay more taxes, and maybe the depositors and the whole thing. And the bankers said, okay, you idiot socialists, you're going to wreck the economy. You're going to impose taxes, and nobody will what? Deposit any money in our banks, and that will be the end of the Swiss miracle. So there, destroy yourself. But there was that tension. And there was the tension that came with World War I. In World War I, the French and the Germans and the Italians were on opposite sides. The French and Italians were on one side, the Germans were on the other. If you were Swiss, where was your sympathy? Well, if you were German Swiss, you most likely sort of liked the Germans. If you were French Swiss, you sort of liked the French. That is, there was the tension of the war, and then arrived the Depression and Adolf Hitler. And when Adolf Hitler arrived, his great dream was to unite all the Germans of Europe. Well, there were the Germans of Germany, but there were the Germans in Czechoslovakia, and there were the Germans in Austria, and there were the Germans in Alsace, and there were the Germans in Poland. And a very large group of Germans were where? In Switzerland. Switzerland should have been a logical country for Adolf to annex. In fact, a movement started called Pan-Germanism. It swept Austria. That's why all those people were cheering Adolf when he came into Vienna in 1938. There were thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Swiss Germans who liked what he had to say. And in fact, they were very favorable to it. And they also picked up another message which came with pan-Germanism in the 1930s, and that was anti-Semitism. One of the issues that the arrival of Hitler created was now there were thousands of refugees from Germany. There were 600,000 Jews in Germany. 250,000 had decided to pick themselves up and move. The United States of America took 100,000. Great Britain took 52,000. But a logical place for them to go to, because they were German speaking and it was right on the border, I mean, they could get there, was Switzerland. And that became an issue. Would the Swiss, as a humanitarian measure, given their reputation for what? For being internationalists and whatever else it is, and lovey-doveys and the whole thing. Would they not open their borders and allow these people even temporarily to come in and to settle down? One of the issues was money. One of the places for the German government to get money was where? Swiss bank. They were loaded with money. And what if the German government or German officials came to Swiss banks and they said, well, we'd like to borrow some money. What should the response of the Swiss banks be? And then there was the whole issue of conquest. If Switzerland wanted to remain independent, it would have to persuade Hitler that it should remain independent. Because Hitler had a huge army. He conquered what? Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, the Netherlands, Belgium, France. Italy was on his side. If he had wanted to march into Switzerland, this big thing about, we'll retire to the Alps. What do you mean retire to the Alps? So go up into the mountains, kiddo. We'll take all the cities and the banks. Had Adolf Hitler wanted to invade Switzerland and take it, he could have. In fact, part of the population would have been sympathetic to the acquisition. They were into pan-Germanism. One of the issues for Switzerland was how to persuade Adolf not to do it. And certainly one of the issues, and you have to look at it, I mean, Switzerland was surrounded. And the Swiss tell you that all the time. Well, it's very easy for you, sitting in Detroit, to talk about our situation. But if the city of Detroit or the Michigan were surrounded by enemies who wanted to invade, you would do almost anything to what? To survive. One of the big issues had to do with deposits. Let's say you were a high Nazi official and you had a lot of money which you had looted and stolen from all your victims. Could you come into a Swiss bank and say, I want to make a deposit? Nobody would ask you any questions, and now the deposit would be secret, and the banker would say, I don't care whether you're the mafia, Nazis, whatever, this is just a bank. You bring in any money you want, and we will not tell anybody what you put in there. We are an honorable bank.